Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the new economy that emerges during the post-World War I era and really talk about how that impacts the political leadership that we see in the United States. So we're going to be moving a little more quickly today, so make sure you're paying attention and pausing if you need to, rewind if you need to. Make sure you're getting those guided notes completed. Well, the economy during this period is really going to be revolutionized by the ideas of Henry Ford. The first cars appeared in the United States in the late 1800s, but up to that point, only the wealthy could afford them. It wasn't until Henry Ford began selling the Model T in 1908 that begins to change. And Ford combined three main ideas. One, making cars simple and identical instead of doing things in a highly expensive custom manner. Also making the process smooth using interchangeable parts and moving conveyor belts. And finally, number three, determining how workers should move at what speed to be the most productive. And this becomes known, these ideas become known as the assembly line. And really, this is the revolution that changes all of American manufacturing. It's a production system in which the item being built moves along a conveyor belt to simple workstations that require workers to do one or two simple skills. And by the 1920s, Ford was producing a car every minute. And this dropped prices so that by 1929, there were about 22 million cars in the United States. And Ford also raises workers' wages enough so they could afford to buy the cars. And he opposed unions. And his assembly line obviously was not very exciting for workers. It was boring, but it dramatically increases the amount of product that he can produce. And the effects are massive. Ford Motor Company dominated the auto business for about 15 years, but eventually the entire industry began to use the assembly line to its advantage. General Motors, Chrysler tried to improve on Ford's formula. They started offering new designs and started really competing with Ford. Other industries also learned from these ideas. The assembly line techniques are going to be used to make large quantity of goods at lower prices, which raises productivity by about 60% during this time period. And the success of these businesses leads to what becomes known as welfare capitalism. And this is a system in which companies provide benefits to employees to promote worker satisfaction and loyalty. So they would pay company pensions, recreation programs, all of these things, and I hope that if we provide these incentives, then workers will accept lower wages, which they often did. The car industry changed society. Demand for steel, rubber, and glass and other car materials soared, and auto repair shops and filling stations began to pop up throughout the United States. It also leads to the growth of motels and restaurants to cater to travelers' needs. Also, landowners who found oil on their property, which was needed to run these new internal combustion engines, became wealthy almost overnight. Cities and suburbs began to pop up. Detroit obviously grew when Ford based his plant there, and other automakers did as well. Other Midwestern cities like Akron, Ohio boomed because they made necessities like rubber and tires that cars needed. Also, now with cars, you had the growth of suburbs. So you have more vehicles that people can drive to work. You have more public transportation like trolley lines, subways, buses, things of that nature that increase the ability of people to commute to work. Also, an entire new industry called tourism was born. This freedom to travel by car produced a new tourism industry. Before the auto boom, Florida was attractive to the wealthy, but cars brought tourists to the beaches by thousands. And so buyers started snatching up land, which causes price to rise, and some Florida swamps were drained completely to put up new housing and real estate developments and hotels and resorts and things of that nature. During the 1920s, new production methods, assembly line is going to have an explosion of new products, experiences, and forms of communication that really stimulated the economy and created a new consumer. And all these new products, factories were turning out electronic appliances like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and more homes are wired for electricity. The radio also grows exponentially and really connects the world. By the late 1920s, 40% of homes had a radio, and families would gather around it nightly, and they had shows on radio like they do television now. Also, the first passenger airplanes began to crop up during the 1920s. Most were more uncomfortable than trains, but there was a thrill-seeking aspect to flying. Now, with all these new products, companies had to figure out how to sell them. So advertisers became kind of the new cheerleaders of the economy, and they started developing persuasive advertising to convince people to buy their products. They began to pay for space in publications. Companies would sponsor radio shows, and this advertising money made these shows available to the public, and the ads gave their products wide exposure and created new consumers. At the same time, new methods of paying for products make more things widely available. Before this period, most Americans, saved them up and saved up money and bought things. Maybe borrowing houses for very large, important, expensive items like houses, but borrowing becomes more respectable in the 1920s. And you have the onset of installment buying, or paying for an item over time in small payments. They bought on credit, which is basically borrowing money to buy things. Consumers quickly took to installment buying and purchased new products on the market. And by the end of the decade, 90% of durable goods or long-lasting goods like cars and appliances were bought on credit. Advertisers encouraged the use of credit, telling consumers they can get what they want now with small payments, and they would barely miss the money. You guys see these kinds of ads on TV all the time. Low monthly payments, three low payments of $19.95, or buy this car for only $200 a month. However, this credit leads to weaknesses in the economy. The Roaring '20s is often seen as a time of prosperity, but many Americans were suffering in the post-war period, most notably farmers. American farmers had good times during World War I, high demand, high prices, but as demand slowed and Europe emerged from the post-war destruction, you start to have more competition. Now, the government tried to help in 1921 by passing a tariff making foreign farm products more expensive, but it really didn't help much. In fact, it just made it more difficult to sell their products. Also, you had a series of natural disasters during this time. The boll weevil infestations ruined cotton crops. You had a massive flood of Mississippi River in 1927 that killed thousands and left many homeless. And you had the strongest hurricane recorded up to that point, killing 243 people in Florida. So natural disasters added to the difficulties for farmers. Finally, land speculation in Florida creates a land boom that eventually, bubbles burst. And what happens is the real estate bubble in Florida burst, and Florida sank into an economic depression, even as other parts of the nation enjoyed prosperity. We saw something similar to happen in 2007, 8, 9 with the economic crisis, and it drastically impacted land prices in Florida. Now, at the same time you have these problems facing the economy, you also have the Harding and Coolidge presidencies, which really champion laissez-faire economics, hands off the government, and people are less able to get the help that they may need. First of these is Warren G. Harding. And Harding grew up in Ohio, where people believed in taking care of one another without the help of government. Harding was elected as U.S. Senator in 1914, but he was not very interested in being senator. He skipped a lot of sessions. He missed the historic debates on prohibition and women's suffrage. And as president, he regarded the job as mostly ceremonial and told friends that, he really wasn't up to the task of the job. His friendly backslapping manner and his avoidance of taking hard stances on the issues, however, made him popular. And when Wilson's term ended, Republicans wanted to win back the White House. Harding was not a leading candidate, but his message about a return to normalcy really appealed to American voters. And there was no dominant Republican leader, so Harding was nominated kind of in a backroom deal at the Republican convention. In his race against James Cox, the Democrat from Ohio, Harding's vision of normalcy and refusal to take a stance at all on the League of Nations basically gained him a overwhelming victory, won over 60% of the vote, which is a landslide in a presidential election. Harding was kind of your traditional laissez-faire government president. He believed less government in business and more business in government. He sought to cut the federal budget, reduce taxes for the wealthy Americans, believing that that wealth would trickle down to other Americans and pull America out of hard times. Harding offered very little to farmers, though he did sign the Ford-Macomber tariff, which raised the cost of foreign farm products. But it also raised prices for American farm products, which helped U.S. farmers in the short term, but made it even harder for European nations to pay back their war debts. And the tariff, and it really has a negative impact on the American economy as European nations default on debt, and they answer with their own tariffs, and it really locks up trade. Really, this is the only measure that Harding does take to help American agriculture. Harding's presidency is really marked by a series of scandals, however. He compensates for his poor governing skills by hiring highly skilled cabinet members, such as Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who reformed the tax system, and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, and Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, which are also incredibly successful cabinet members. Hoover gains national notoriety for his handling of the 1927 flood and other actions. Some cabinet members, however, were old friends that were called the Ohio Gang, and many of them were later convicted of taking bribes. For instance, Secretary of Interior Albert Fall was convicted and jailed for accepting bribes in return for allowing oil companies to drill on federal reserves on government land in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Harding was distressed by the rumors, and he took a trip to Alaska, and on his way back, he stops in Seattle and gives a speech and collapses, dying not long after. Harding's popularity was high when he died, but after his death, his own failings and the corruption of his administration begins to sour his reputation over time. But at the time of his death, he was wildly popular, and people really loved him. Calvin Coolidge is vice president, takes office after that, and Coolidge is much different than Harding. He was raised in a modest rural Vermont home. He graduated from college in Amherst, Massachusetts, and took up law and politics. He was the governor of Massachusetts and gained fame during the Boston police strike. But as president, he got rid of officials suspected of corruption. He thought business helped society and that government should be limited, much like Harding. And he also worked to lower taxes and reduce federal spending. He didn't institute any government programs to help farmers or veterans. Coolidge was serious and straightforward, often known as Silent Cow. Although he did like to play practical jokes on White House staff, but he wasn't good at small talk. He was very different from Harding in that regard. But he was popular at the time, but he didn't like being president, and he decided not to run for re-election in 1928. The economy is also bearing the lingering effects of World War I. European nations have borrowed more than $10 billion from the U.S., but it was difficult for European countries to pay that back, and the Ford-Macomber tariff made it even more difficult. Instead, the U.S. turned to Germany, demanding European governments put more pressure on Germany for war reparations. Germany was unable to pay, leaving the Allies unable to pay their debts. So the U.S. actually lent money to Germany, so Germany could pay back Europe, so Europe could pay back the United States, which creates a cyclical problem that continues through the 1920s. And during this time, you also had a lot of action to try to prevent future wars. You had the Washington Naval Conference. Peacetime brought pressure to reduce the size of U.S. armed forces, but some people feel that world naval powers, including Great Britain and Japan, were in an arms race. So the U.S. organized the Washington Naval Conference, inviting all major naval powers. As a result, countries cut back the size of their navies and scrapped existing ships and some under construction. It also led to an agreement on several issues, including plans to avoid competition for control of China. Many Americans thought the conference was a huge success, including the Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes. And however, it was not long before the world tension rose again and more ships were built for war. At the same time, Billy Mitchell, a U.S. general, was arguing that we should invest more in air power. He was not very popular, though. He was very confrontational, and he left the military and continued to promote air power until his death in the 1930s. The high tide of the anti-war movement, though, was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically was signed on by 60 nations, and basically everybody agreed that war was not an acceptable answer to